very interested in consciousness and bent on constructing and proving that I've invented an artifact with consciousness in it. And part of the journey that I've gone on to get to the point where I think I'm making some progress involved dealing with the concept of being in a really practical, scientific way. And it appears to me, I've never written it up. Actually, no, I did write something once. It appears that not many people, and especially scientists, really deal with the idea of being insofar as that we're inside this large system of stuff called the universe, and there are properties that we inherit as a result, intrinsically as a result of that very state of affairs. And the simple, I should use a chair. Chairs were very topical the other day, but I use this thing here. It doesn't matter, you can choose anything, and there's one thing that all of us can appreciate is that there is a perspective on the rest of the universe from the point of view of being that piece of matter which happens to be arranged as a whiteboard eraser. And that perspective on the rest of the universe, we can imagine it. You cannot really imagine what it's like. That's the other terminology that comes along with this discussion. We all have a pretty good idea of what it's like to be us. And when I'm hearing music, it's like hearing music. This is a term that comes from David Chalmers, who you probably remember from the conference. And it's probably a reasonable guess to say that it's not like much to be this. However, there is an innate perspective of the rest of the universe that is intrinsically acquired by being any collection of matter. And if I had an identical one of these, and I put it, here we go, got two nearly identical remote controls, let's say they were identical, their identity, the true identity of those two objects, given that they are actually the same physically to us, is impossible, because the perspective on the rest of the universe that one has includes that one, which is to the left of it, and the perspective on the rest of the universe that this one has includes this one, which is to the right of it. And it doesn't matter what you do, being in the universe actually incorporates a unique perspective on the rest of the universe. And it creates intrinsically a difference between whatever the thing is and the rest of the universe. And the thing that I would like to draw to your attention, that makes this very brief, is the fact that there is something different about what's going on in our brains, which makes the act of our brain being in the universe different to anything else.
Different to another brain?
No, to
normal
matter.
Different, like my brain has something going on in it which manifests the what it is like description that my knee doesn't. For example, the cells in my knee don't do what my brain does. My brain's doing something that makes it feel like there's something happening on my knee, but it's actually not happening at my knee at all. My knee's dead. It's actually happening up here, and it's been projected at my knee by my brain like an image. And that applies to all of the sensory systems. So the key to the fuller understanding of consciousness includes identifying the key essence of the operation of the behaviour, the material of the brain that takes advantage of some innate faculty that comes with everything that is simply magnified in our brains by brain material. Now, the rest of my research involves a claim that electromagnetism is actually used to construct that entire system of experience that we have from our head. Other people have different ideas. Being in the universe an understanding how being in the universe can actually contribute to consciousness is something that has to be dealt with. It's the other side of my practical work. I've got the real world and then I've got the sort of more esoteric world. You can't avoid it with consciousness. There is a reason for brains being the way they are, and I believe that being in and of itself is actually intimately part of that. And it's really the only thing I wanted to raise your awareness of and try and mull it over in your own time, because it's pretty interesting stuff.
Sorry, could you just repeat your point that it's part of the structure of the brain, is it? Is that what you're saying?
So that there is an innate fabric of the universe which is organised in a special way in our heads, and the relationship between it and everything else is part of the process of generating conscious experience. And the fact that what's going on in here can be proven to not be going on in that thing is a pretty good way of supporting a claim that that thing there is not conscious and it's not like anything to be that thing.
Isn't there an article called What It's Like to Be a Bat or something?
Yeah, Thomas Nagel.
Yeah, has that got something to do with what you're saying?
Yeah, in deeper, in one end of the discussion, that was where I started a long time ago.
Is he talking about identity here or consciousness? Because I tend to get them confused sometimes.
I think the two are interwoven in a way that you cannot separate.
And is the bat conscious?
Yeah, I think it's actually having a pretty good visual scene that's generated by an audio interaction.
It's something that has senses and can experience pain conscious.
Yeah. Any phenomenal scene, if you have any at all, that includes everything, then that, whatever that is has consciousness in it. Doesn't matter how intelligent you are.
So if you go down to an ant, is an ant conscious?
And we had this discussion earlier this week. I'm not entirely sure. I think that the tiny little ants may have a really, really vague idea of what, especially in terms of their detection of pheromones. It might feel good when they hit pheromones.
So when you get
The big bull ants, however, they can see you. They look back at you, so they know you're there.
you get to a point where an amoeba or something, you're not going to be conscious. You get down to the smallest particles of
I can
living matter.
foresee the possibility that single-cell organisms, from the point of view of being a single-cell organism, there may be really primitive experiences of light and dark or something else, pressure.
You're saying life is conscious.
No,
There's a particle of consciousness in all life. Or okay, so plants aren't conscious.
the scenes that constitute consciousness
Because plants are aware of life.
the properties of the universe that are used to construct the scenes that are our consciousness are in everything. It's built into the fabric of the place, and that they're only operated appropriately to actually focus and construct a real working scene with this kind of behaviour. Well, in my case, electric fields dancing about.
But how is that different from fins and flippers being used to move in water? If you don't have liquid water, they're all pretty useless. Web feet or anything else. It's just an adaptation to this ubiquitous environment.
Yeah, it's been.
If that environment's there, you'll adapt to it. If you manage to cross a threshold, then you won't adapt to it if you're.
Yeah, that could happen without consciousness.
Now, why is consciousness different from swimming?
I can't even see any meaning in the question.
Well, I don't see any meaning in consciousness, so that's basically the same
That's
thing.
the problem.
That's the problem.
You don't.
What?
Are you conscious?
conscious?
Oh,
Do
only.
you have a
No,
first person?
only in the very
Oh,
soft
you need to
sense.
go and see Dennett. He's talking up here at the Asia Centre next
Dennett doesn't.
Wednesday.
But you have
Yeah.
a first person experience, don't you?
Yeah, but that's
Well,
for
that's
revolutionary reasons.
What?
Yeah, but it's nothing special.
Oh, I'm not arguing
Oh,
about
Like
yeah.
this.
Yeah, mine is
We
too.
didn't say it was
It's very
special.
important to me.
It could be common or garden variety consciousness for all we care, but it's still.
Yeah.
No, it's nothing special in,
It is actually
In- in
special, but it is
Very
there. It's
special.
unique to you.
Yeah,
Because
but
it's
in-
not, there's no other being like you.
yeah, and I will argue that we're all very unique and very important and we're great works of art.
I didn't
that
say
all
important, I
live
said
for 500
unique.
years and things like that.
You
But
can have a unique knot that's not that,
But-
it's still not important.
consciousness is just a sensible, it's a gradual thing. The gulf we try and put between ourselves and animals, or then between animals with nervous systems and other forms without. Is a tornado conscious? Is a bushfire conscious?
Well, there's one
Is
source
Yellowstone.
of information about consciousness that we're
No.
pretty sure about, and that's the one we have. Now, science has a problem with
But
that.
look, it has a greater survival advantage to believe that this ego thing matters. But
So you're being Buddhist about it.
the Buddhists kind of got to the same point for different reasons, yeah.
Yeah.
I just don't see. We have to, and we're actually doing at a social level everything we possibly can to devalue it. But you've got to have this sense of self to want to get up the next day.
I would
I'm
suggest
saying,
that,
how does it arise in the first
I would
place?
suggest that
You're
language,
presupposing it.
language or communication is a pretty good
Hmm.
leading indicator of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's something is,
But I'd say
if something is.
I think language blinds us to almost everything that's going on in the universe. I think it actually gets in the way of us seeing almost
Well,
everything.
okay, information transmission and reception is.
I think you have to stick to the formal definition of consciousness, which in experience of being your first person perspective,
Yeah.
Sure.
where subjective
There's one
experience crosses objective reality.
Concept of existence.
Okay, at that point we have this system called consciousness, which I have, which I don't know if any of you have got, sorry, but I have it and I find it interesting. Now Colin claims to have it, he also finds it interesting.
So we're back to Descartes. I
Yeah,
experienced
I think we've
therefore
come
I
a long
am.
way past that.
We
All
can
of the,
stand on
for
that.
example,
Well, I do-
there's a
Wrong
huge
with that?
literature at the moment which is gradually coming out of the neurons into the interstitial matter between the neurons and sticking probes in there and highly correlating people's reports of experiences with field measurements. And that has gone a long way past Descartes. So now, we're in a position where, if that signal
this
is
is
there, you've got
Francis
red,
Crick's model of, that's what he's
well,
going.
this is in terms of science, it's as good as it gets at the moment. Right? You're correlating reports of experience with some physical phenomenon.
Okay, but then that just gets us back to this age-old thing of how to transmute the water of existence to the wine of experience,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm
and
saying
that's-
that one of the...
We have a story of rods and cones and dancing electrical fields and cells, metabolizing and what have you, but that doesn't seem to get
Well, one of...
what it really means to be me.
No, exactly.
This
No,
thing
but-
here...
But it is
One of the
fair
ways
to
of
look at
dealing
neural correlates.
Sorry.
Correlates, Jeff. It is
Yeah.
fair to look at neural
I'm
correlates.
not saying it's, I agree.
If you see phenomena that seem to be present when there is consciousness present by your own definition,
Yeah.
then it's reasonable to look at
Dig
them
there.
as possible links or even possible causalities to consciousness. Maybe not. They might
Correlation to
Be,
causation.
but they
They're
could be
prerequisites.
themselves caused by consciousness. You
Yeah,
can't be sure.
right. But they're just prerequisites, aren't they? I mean,
But
having
it's a
a
good
brain
way to
is
start. Isn't
No,
it?
it's a prerequisite, we
It's a
think.
good objective way to start.
At the moment, it's the only thing we know that
Yeah,
we can pretty sure is conscious. And the fact that we have difficulty in the explanation of it is actually a problem with science, not a problem with the natural world. We just haven't, the science itself hasn't matured enough to cope with that side of the equation. And one of the ways of dealing with that side of the equation, the first person, is by dealing with that in a very logical...
Being it's such a German philosophical. What's it?
Yeah,
Days in. That's the German. I just remember.
Yeah,
that.
Daisy, Heidegger.
I mean, I always kind of like sort of
Yeah, I know.
clench my
Doesn't
buttocks.
objective falsifiability mean that consciousness must in some sense always remain outside the possibility of science?
Why?
Because it's
Subjective.
subjective, it's the
Just
water
by
wine
definition.
problem.
Yeah. But the scientific explanation of something that's subjective is obviously as an
Unmeasurable.
unknown. It's an unknown, but it's not unknowable.
There's
It's
a-
unmeasurable.
there's
How
an
do you
old-
measure
It's
it?
only unknowable in essence if you declare science is out of bounds to it.
There's an
Well,
old,
I mean,
So-
I use the word. I mean, I use the word science in a fairly tight sense.
Yeah,
I use it
recognise that.
specifically to talk about statements which make objectively falsifiable, which can objectively falsifiable, and that seems to me to, how can you put it, tautologically exclude consciousness. It doesn't exclude it as a correlative, as a neural correlate, but in some sense,
it's part of metaphysics.
it's part of metaphysics.
No, I've actually.
Well, you're using metaphysics,
Well,
dies in
There you
being.
go.
It's
We've
exactly.
actually got language which is in the road. For 2,000 years, people have used the word metaphysics inappropriately. I've written a paper in it's in the Journal of Consciousness Studies.
Colin corrects Plato.
Yeah,
No, no,
that's
no,
great.
no,
They've been wrong all that time.
How do you use the word metaphysics, just as a matter of interest?
I just mean it's something that transcends physics. That's, as you say, not objectively
I still
testable.
see, I mean, a lot of these words are very ambiguous. Philosophy is rife with it. But I mean, I use the word metaphysics to mean things which which involve simultaneously subjective and objective phenomena. For example, the film where the person was asleep in a in some sort of a thing, and his avatar was doing something else. I can't think of the name of it.
Pandora.
No.
It was Avatar.
Avatar.
Yeah, not that one. No. The
Matrix.
Matrix, yeah, Matrix is a I consider it as just to illustrate my use of the word metaphysics. I consider that as having a metaphysical content, or the nursery rhyme, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. So if life is but a dream, is my dream the same as yours? Is
My experience is read the same as yours.
Yeah.
No.
We don't know.
this is-
That's what we can never know.
No,
Let's just go back to the point you made about whether it be possible to prove consciousness in a way. What would happen if you were, if a system, a machine, was to be able to give you subjectively a new qualia, a new experience, like a new sense?
that would be intersubjectivity.
You can do that.
Yes, to give you a subjective experience of a new qualia. Wouldn't that be a degree of proof? Because qualia is obviously very intrinsically connected to consciousness.
It's got you there because objectivity, the word for objectivity in science is intersubjectivity.
Now, we have clearly about 6 qualia that are clearly described, our 5 senses, one other.
There's a
Now,
lot more. Since it-
if-
A lot of different flavours within
What-
them.
What about
But-
music?
but-
End senses, whatever.
And you could argue that olfactory and taste are the same one.
It's
But
all-
that aside, if we could imbue in you a new qualia, would that go to convince you that we were somehow manipulating consciousness?
And proving
So
So
consciousness.
it's now
I'm
subjective.
not saying you can't produce phenomena in consciousness, that there aren't correlates of.
If we were to give you telepathy, telepathic experience.
What
Hey.
we have, that our subjective experience doesn't have, won't have all sorts of, obviously the way, the progress in brain, imaging is progressing, and all sorts of correlates of subjective experience will probably be discovered, and probably a great deal that we don't even have now.
Yeah.
But I still say that, that in that tautological sense, that when you say objective, it means that somebody else can see it.
Yes.
doesn't
That's
it?
right.
Perceive
The
it.
same
It's
way.
impossible.
The
That's what
same
I'm saying.
way.
Imagine that we had a device and we said, okay, we're going to mitigate, we're going to give you a new qualia. We're going to call it whatever we like. You're going to experience it. And we put that qualia into your head, and you now have an experience of something. I'll relate back to the story I was talking to you about. There was a guy who was colourblind to a particular frequency of colours. But by using forms of optical illusions, which are known to create colours, they were able to invoke in that person the experience of that colour, which that person referred to as Martian colours, because he'd never seen these colours before, and he had no experience of them because he had no senses to detect them. But he described them in his terminology for Martian colours. I think a very interesting term, which we know to be green or whatever it was, colour that he was lacking.
You've got to remember the vision comes from back here,
Yes.
not your eyes.
Anyway, the simple answer is no. But I mean, I would ask you another question. Supposing you had a machine which you could, we can almost do it. We can trace incoming responses back into the brain, and we can watch the behaviour, and we can see the response as it comes out. Now, make it one stage more. You look at yourself, and you are watching sensory information coming in. You can see your own sensory information coming in objectively, coming into your brain, and a response coming out of your brain. But at no time do you actually find something which you call subjective experience.
Okay.
You don't find...
You can actually
No, that's
refine
correct.
that argument a bit more and say, let's analyse music. You can analyse music to the nth degree and dissect it with physics down to a million decimal places, and none of it would depict what it is like to hear that music.
Yes, exactly.
So you've got the other side of the coin. There are two halves of this thing. I might have a go.
Really, don't you think it'd be possible to perhaps find the precise pattern of music that causes you to feel sad?
Yeah, but
But it's not about the music, it's about the people
it's about the
interpreting.
experience of it,
Feeling
not
of
the...
it.
But also,
Yeah.
in all of this,
But if you could come up with a model
you're
that-
assuming that we're going to suddenly reductionalise and
It's
say,
just
okay, that's...
an oxymoron.
But no, in all of the cases where people come up with a theory of consciousness, they will describe it as, say, quantum mechanical, such as decoherence, and say that decoherence is your conscious experience. But it's not itself something that is reductionalisable into your standard material object, into your standard algorithmic description. It is an additional, extra-dimensional characteristic which is then labelled as your conscious self. And if you can manipulate that and give you new qualia, and say, okay, this is it occurring in you, and here's some new qualia, that goes a long way to saying, yes, that probably is a good understanding of your conscious
And following
experience.
that, who can
I
remember the
think,
story?
I think it's a more refined correlation of subjective experiences. There's a lot of subjective experience that we dismiss. But I mean, I think that it's quite possible people, that you can develop. You can acquire information about your body that you don't normally have. It's there subjectively, and if you practice meditation or something like that, you can start to
Expand your
perhaps you
consciousness.
see, hear your heart beating or develop controls and
Not tonight.
all sorts of things
What
that
about
are,
We're not talking about what you experience. We're talking about that you experience. We're talking about your very experiential self, the hard problem of consciousness.
What about
that we
the-
have a first person.
The example of Helen Keller, I really want to throw that in. She had no experience of sensory information. Was she
Very
not?
little.
She was blind, as I recall,
And
deaf,
deaf.
and dumb too. I don't know.
She weren't
She
clear.
couldn't-
But actually, when she was very young, she wasn't. She actually lost her.
She was living in essentially a black void, but she had tactile experience,
Yeah.
and they were trying to recreate qualia, give her experience of some consciousness of the outside world. And I think they finally made the breakthrough when they wrote water.
We don't
water
know.
on
Yeah,
a thing.
they put a hand on the water.
Water or something like that. That was an expansion of her consciousness. So that would indicate that consciousness obviously can grow. Qualia,
Not necessarily. Most like consciousness diminishes as you get older. But that's neither here nor there. The point
she
is,
had different
did
experience.
Helen Keller have a first-person experience
Yes.
before she came to be able to communicate that to the outside world? And I'd say the answer is probably yes,
Yes.
but we just don't understand it. We don't even understand it afterwards. The question we're discussing here is if we had a theory of first-person experience, if there was a theory of first-person experience, and that theory was testable to the point of giving you different qualia, which is a fairly substantial thing, In other words, we have this description saying, okay, given these following conditions, this subjective classification will have a first-person experience, and then we can give that first-person experience additional qualia, then I think you'd be on your way to having a pretty good theory of
Yeah.
I'm
objective
hell bent
consciousness.
on building chips, and I know that.
Chips that do what?
Chips that I put in a robot which I will claim is conscious. But I know that the scientific proof, the full scientific proof, would be the special typing of these chips and then putting it in a head and integrating it into the cortex and adding to the experience. And then if you can switch on red, switch it off, then you're pretty much guaranteed you've worked out what's going on. That's
Qualia.
way to qualia, yeah.
But is that consciousness?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is perhaps one of the areas that needs a bit of work because, for example, sadness. Sadness is a scene, like vision. Only it's different. It's isotropic. Comes at you from all directions, the same. Except I'm not entirely sure that you get sadness from under your feet. But that's like a blind spot. Like
Standing
I
on a
can't.
snail you do.
Sorry.
Standing on a snail you do.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, I can direct sadness down there if I focus on it, I suppose. But I have a blind spot behind me that I have. It's not that it's black. There is no vision that I'm having. It's not like anything
No, so you're
for
not like
me
the,
back there.
you're not like the other
People claim that
6,900,000,000 and whatever. That imagine there's some danger back there.
there's
Right,
people
it's
have
not the
claimed
same
that they've
thing.
been able to
No,
develop
imagination is
3D
another
vision
thing.
in their dream state.
Yeah. That's not
Dream-
visual
dreams
scene.
are-
That's
I
an
know.
imagined scene. See, you've got all these different scenes, like haptic. Haptic is another scene that's generated in the frontal, the rear of the frontal cortex. There's a map, and all of the sensory information is projected at the rest of your body. And if you poke the bit of cortex, you'll feel it, right? Wherever it is. Now, that's another scene that's projected out. The visual scene is another one that's projected out, and it's highly anisotropic and inhomogeneous. It's different wherever you look.
So you referred there to laws of appearance and structure. I get that's a reference to Kant's phenomena and nomina. And nomina.
Yeah.
Nomina being
well, not
structure.
really. This is the way that I broke down science to deal with the first-person perspective. And I actually have third-person proof of consciousness. And it's actually scientists. Because all scientific evidence arrives as qualia in our heads. And if you take the qualia out of the head, you get no science. So if this was a law of nature, let's say
Well, how come computers can do something?
that's not, no, scientists made the computers that then data mine science. That's not science. There's no observation going on. Here's your bucket of laws of nature. It's been built for 2,000 years. And here's scientists. And he's got a law of nature. And he's used his qualia and he's written a paper. He's got measurements that he got with his own eyes. And he's derived a law of nature. And it goes into the journal system like that. Now, if you take away the qualia of our scientist, there's
Sorry,
no
what's
observation.
qualia again? I'm just not quite
Qualities.
Quality, the opposite of quanta.
So
Quanta
there's
is
like
Now,
phenomena.
there's kind of three things in consciousness. There's self-awareness, there's free will, and there's this thing called qualia, which is the kind of subjective essence of the feeling of the greenness
What
of
is it?
green, the
What's it
sadness
like?
of sad. It's ostensibly some kind of unique magical thing that occurs in the human brain that makes it a kind of unique, or
What was
animal
that?
brains, it makes it this sort of
What was the
unique
three things
thing.
you said? Sense of self,
Sense of self, free will,
free will.
And
I'm
qualia.
sure
Free-
and these things all get mixed up and
I'm not sure free will is part of consciousness.
No.
Could-
Well,
could you-
but I'm not, I think
Sense
the
of
whole
self is
consciousness,
also-
yeah, self-awareness,
It's
but
qualia.
my
It's
view
all
is the
qualia.
whole
Yeah.
thing is a bogus issue, but when I listen to people talking, you hear these three things, which is self-awareness, free will, and qualia.
They tend to be
Well, that's
thrown in
first
together.
two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's feeling.
So qualia is
A lot of
this,
people
The
reject the
subjective
first
things
two.
you experience.
yeah, so,
When I talk
You
about
can't-
consciousness, I'm
So-
only talking about qualia.
Yeah,
so,
I
so
think
this idea that you cannot, you know, that this sort of greenness of green is some kind of thing that cannot be scientifically explained, it exists beyond physical reality in some way, shape or form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels like that, I agree.
Tony,
But,
It's a unique
I think
experience.
but whether it is
the
like that,
problem
I don't
is,
know.
I mean, there's a semantic problem, which is to do what, I mean, we all think we, use the word consciousness in the same way,
Yeah.
but I'm afraid there's
We don't, yeah.
quite radically different usages of the word, and I have to say that I don't think you and I are using it in the same sense.
Yeah, I'm almost sure of it. What I'm here today really to do is to try and get some more specificity into the language. When I say consciousness, I mean nothing else but qualia, the subjective qualities that are experienced from a first-person perspective.
As opposed to objective quanta of third parties.
Yeah, well, a third-person description of something, which
Quanta.
could become a law of nature. That's not qualia.
Okay, so let's imagine someone came up with a theory that said, I can explain all your qualia, I can explain why people say they have these experiences, I can explain the structure of these experiences, when they happen, why they happen, blah, 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 blah. And here is my explanation of why this feeling that is some unique, special, magical thing is actually illusory. Just like, say, free will is illusionary if you're a determinist. But we think we have free will, but... Okay, so imagine that happened. What's left? Like we have this sort of shrinking universe of things we can't explain, and 100 years ago it was life.
Revisited in a different dimension.
200 years ago it was sort of thunder,
I see
And
that
we've
the
got
gap
down to this-
itself is the explanatory gap that everyone goes on about. There's been a thread on, there's a list, an email forum that I'm enrolled in.
Yeah.
The explanatory gap's got like 900 posts to it. It just goes on
Yeah.
and on and on.
Yeah.
There is a difference between objective descriptions and the subjective world. And that difference is what I'm trying to get, because I believe it's the key to an intelligent machine.
A conscious.
Consciousness. A machine that can behave intelligently in respect of the natural world in the same way that scientists are. Remember, I said that a scientist can be held as literal proof if you can engage in a scientific act on total novelty, something that has never been encountered before, and that's very important. Then you must have qualia. And if you don't have qualia, you can be fooled really easily. And so that paper where I broke science down into two types of science is the one which, this one here, laws of appearances, are the ones that we traditionally engage in. They're not explanations of anything, and they never were explanations of anything. They merely describe the qualia that someone else will observe that they will have if the law obeys the rule. So the world will appear, for example, F equals ma, Newton's second law. Right? If that is true, then there should be nowhere in the universe where the visual scene of a human being will be inconsistent with F equals ma when measured. And that is an experience on the heart of an observer. How do you explain the observer? You don't. You never. These presuppose an observer and assumes it.
But the observer's in the system, not outside the system.
Yep, we're all inside the system and we're observers. And we're observing the system from within. And we're being part of it in the process.
But the thing is the only part of the system which we can't seem to observe is the part which we inhabit.
That's right. Well,
Maybe
we're
observe that.
we're observing it from a first-person perspective, and I would say that if in a fuller, more developed science, the first-person perspective would be accepted as a natural encounter with as much authority in science as anything else.
Well, we have artists. Artists are to consciousness as scientists are to existence. Well, artists are to experience as scientists are to existence.
Way, yeah.
That's very
Talk
artistic.
about that.
But see,
Very pithy.
That's it, huh?
Yeah.
Very pithy.
the real
That's
problem,
my job.
the real problem I have with this, Colin, is that your research and your discovery regarding the electromagnetic field through the pores and everything, to me, that just helps get over kind of one of the last gaps in giving a fully sensible explanation for consciousness.
We haven't even started to explain it because...
Well, I think it's so close to totally explained it doesn't matter, because I just don't think there is anything else left to be explained that hasn't been explained. I just don't see this other thing being there.
I disagree entirely.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll be coming up with the mathematics for it fairly soon. And it'll be objective mathematics. And you'll have to sit there and say, right, if that is qualia, then as a scientist, what's missing from my available repertoire of descriptions? And you have to go, well, science is misconfigured.
Right.
So, you know...
Science is a tool set that does certain things. And some things it doesn't do particularly well at all. Now, if you try and apply it to the wrong thing, it just doesn't work.
That's right.
But how do you know what's the wrong thing and what's the right thing to apply it to?
It's all we've got, though.
No, it's not all.
Yeah. Descriptions of things, like there's a law of nature. I could get it published in the Journal of Science right now. There is one red whiteboard marker on that table. It won't last very long. It's a law of nature. And I could get lots of evidence and I could publish
No,
it.
it's a fact, it's not a law.
No. The law of nature is just a sentence that purports to describe a state of affairs somewhere in the
No,
world.
the law attempts to find something which is generally true.
Something that's generally true, is that a fact?
I mean, all of the laws of nature that have ever been come up with have been proven nothing else but ephemeral. Right? Nothing, everything gets overturned. Everything has been overturned.
Yeah,
So that's assumed, not overturned.
Well, fine. It's not
Okay,
quite
refined, developed, expanded.
Go on,
Yeah.
just what I just say.
Okay, so if someone, one of my tests if someone knows something is they can either explain something that was previously complicated in a parsimonious way, or they can predict the future in a way that nobody else can predict, or they can make something that does something that no one else can.
All three of those things.
So what can you offer us in
Descriptions.
those? What can you offer us from your theory then, out of those?
I would say that I've published a test for consciousness, which involves the demand on the conscious object to perform a scientific act on the intrinsically unknown, a priori unknown. If you can do that, it's conscious. And that's the way you sort out one.
That's like a Turing test concept.
Yeah, it's much more refined version of it. You have to demand science from it,
Not just a conversation.
Did you say you had an article in the Journal of Consciousness Studies?
Yep.
Did you write down the reference?
It's just called...
Actually, can you write it on the board? What issue?
2006. It's called Dual Aspect Science.
Yeah, I just see consciousness explained in two words, and that's just selective attention.
No, you're presupposing consciousness.
No, no.
Yes, you are.
Are you a Dennett? You sound like a Dennett.
Yeah, you're trying to explain it away.
Doesn't believe in consciousness.
Well, because that's all you can.
Attention within what?
It's much harder to explaining an electron, or particularly the relationship between electron and proton, is much harder than explaining
Electron is a
consciousness.
description of a natural phenomenon constructed by observers called scientists that is acquired by interacting with electrons. And it's highly predictive of how that interaction between scientists and an electron
But it
will
explains
appear.
nothing.
But it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain what an electron is or where it came from or why it's there or anything else. And that's what this is about. In fact, you probably like my paper because the way I frame that is it's all a cellular automata.
So you're saying there's description, there's appearance, and explanation and structure. Is that?
Yes. These ones have all only and ever described things in an assumed observer. These things describe the structure of the universe in a way that produces an observer that sees the world like that. The two are meshed.
I only see the world as a process.
Well, so do I, and the way it's described is like that, and it's before an observer. This is a priori to an observer. You actually make an observer out of this stuff, and there are lots of different solutions, potential ways.
So structure is objective,
But
appearance is
what you're
subjective.
saying is the world needs observers.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's what we are. We're
No, we're not necessary. We just have.
No,
we're
if
just
we weren't
fortuitous.
here, if we weren't here, none of this would happen.
There would be no
It
appearance.
doesn't mean that the laws aren't active. It just means that we're not there to describe them.
Yeah. So it's all part of
Yeah.
epistemology rather than ontology. Yeah.
Ontology,
Epistemology.
epistemology. This is a dual aspect science that has dualities in a bunch of different ways, and they all mesh nicely. And
No, but we're only studying our knowledge. We're not studying the world.
yeah, we're studying our knowledge of the world, how it appears to us when we look, right? With our qualia of scientists. The one thing that scientists have never done is use themselves as scientific evidence of anything, and I would say they're evidence of consciousness.
Oh, Descartes tried to.
But I mean, perhaps if you approach it from the point of view of language and words, my definition of what a word is it's a symbol. It's a physical symbol of a category of subjective experience. And that when we describe, when we articulate, if we articulate an experience, what we're conveying is a description. We're not conveying the experience.
That's right.
So this notion that somehow what you seem to be, I mean, what I'm taking is that by qualia you're talking about subjective experience,
Yes.
but I simply do not see it as being communicable.
No, you can
What
only...
It's not.
communicate is description.
No.
No. Well, yeah, you communicate descriptions.
And the description is never, in the cliche, it's never the described. But I mean it in the sense that it's ontologically, quite different.
Yep, I would agree entirely.
And
What
so
I'm saying is that the way we handle it...
So when you
is
say that you're,
inappropriate.
giving me a new qualia or something like that, I'm not quite sure what's understood. What do you understand by that?
If I was, let's say I build my chips and I make a little laminated thing, it's flexible, I stick it in your head, and the claims that I make about the origins of consciousness involve saying that when atoms and molecules dance about like this in this particular special way, and interfere with each other in this particular way, and I make it happen in your head, it will make part of your visual scene go red. And then you agree with me.
I mean,
And
you
you can't,
see that as
if you take the chip out and look at it, while it's doing the same thing, you won't see the redness.
No. But I mean, but it's not essentially very different from stimulating part of my brain and producing a memory, say.
No,
I mean, a
there are
memory
bits,
being
there
a
are
subjective
very,
experience.
yeah, you have to, I mean, if you get into the science, the neural correlates science, it's very specific subsets of the brain, and they're actually quite small overall, are responsible for the qualia. And we're gradually...
So I don't have any problem with seeing, with all of our subjective experience, perhaps, finding material or neural correlates. I mean, if you want to be more refined, perhaps it's molecular, biomolecular, or perhaps it's even quantum mechanical. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's just simply a correlate.
Yeah. And so what's your point? Yeah,
It's not a correlate if you
No, it's not just a
view
correlate.
qualia. It would be a correlate if it was just invoking redness. But if it was some experience, some extra sense that you have never had or experienced before, that's experience is due to the incorporation of this entity chip, which is not just stimulating, but is actually part of your conscious experience, and thus giving you a new experience, and I could turn it on and off at will, that would strongly imply that my theory of consciousness is
Exactly.
I just want to show
Yeah.
you a couple of things.
but would actually be my objective experience being reproducible and used subjectively would strongly imply that one beget the other and that the theory was correct.
But it doesn't explain why. It only says what. The why is a whole other thing. Now, deep down in the structure of the universe, there would be some deep reason as to the origins of the redness of red. None of these red things or these green things are actually green at all. All these colours here, there's no such thing as colour. It's invented by your brain and it's projected onto the the
Yeah,
rest of the world.
and other optical systems will work it differently.
Well, yeah.
4 colour birds or 2 colour dogs
yeah,
or whatever else
yeah.
will all.
So, you know, I could, let's say I had a fancy version of my chip that was able to do chair selection, and I could switch my chip on and the chair goes red, and then I switch it off and it goes green. How about I can then claim...
It doesn't seem to be particularly different though, really. I mean, perhaps I'm misunderstanding you, but you're sort of saying you're producing a new subjective experience. Is that correct?
Well, Colin and I did possibly different.
I see.
I'm saying
All right.
that to prove consciousness to you,
Well, hang
I
on.
would
Let's
have
not
to
talk
give you
about
a
proof,
new
because I get
subjective
confused about
experience.
proof.
Sorry.
I said, let's not talk about proof. I find it confusing.
All right.
Use proof
Fair
in
enough.
mathematics,
Let's say
but to find evidence to support it
yeah.
that's consistent
Yes,
with
to
the
give evidence
hypothesis
to
you're presenting.
support
Yeah?
that I have a working theory of consciousness, I would have to invoke that conscious experience in you, which I would call a new qualia.
This
Exporting
theory, for
consciousness
example, I mean, what kind of thing do you mean by a theory of consciousness?
Well,
You're saying that you've got a theory of consciousness which is supported.
Well, if I say, in my case...
I mean, for example, it doesn't have to be a real theory, but I'm just...
All right, well, I would say that your my personal view, and this differs from Colin, is that consciousness is a manifestation of entanglement, and that your entangled state is your conscious state. So there's a theory which I put out there. Now, it's not unique. Other people have had similar theories over time, but that's the theory. That it's actually the what we classically call entanglement, a bit of an irony there, is your conscious experience. Now you say, oh, that's very interesting, but looking at that doesn't give you that experience of consciousness in the same way that talking about what raindrops do to you doesn't make you feel wet. The only way you will share that is if I say, now given this theory, I can now manipulate what's going on in your head and give you a new qualia, here it is. Then you would say, oh, that's interesting. Surely you would say, that's interesting, that I can reproducibly create, using my theory of what consciousness is, an experience in your consciousness, an expansion thereof.
So do we have all these qualia when we're born?
Yeah, the point is that I'm not really disagreeing that we...
You're saying that consciousness is not part of science.
I'm
right?
saying that...
That's
not quite as simple as that. I'm saying that...
trying to get us
that insofar as as science is to do with objective falsification, in this case you're coming down to to quantum correlates of consciousness, and you're saying yes, we can essentially that we can falsify our hypotheses at that level, and I don't have any quarrel with that. I'm not arguing that you can't. I'm just saying that because intrinsically science has to be to do with objective falsification.
I would say that's where it's got to stop. It's that to explain consciousness, science has to get over that.
Well, I can't. I don't think it's a matter of getting over it. It's what you mean by the word science. Certainly, that's what I mean by the word
objective.
science.
It's intersubjective. That's
I mean by objective is that it can be shared. That it's an
Okay,
observation.
That's
shared.
intersubjective. There is no God sitting out there
Shared.
objectively giving you, the Platonic view of everything or the Archimedean point. You just have to accept that
But
objective
at the point
is
of
intersubjective.
consciousness, objective reality crosses subjective reality. At that point, you can do an objective experience subjectively. When you do it in your own head, if you're trying to explore consciousness, which is a subjective experience, then there's nothing, you have to do the experiment in your head, on your subjective experience, even though that is now being done objectively. Because consciousness is the point at which objective reality crosses subjective experience.
But that's actually a claim that may or not be true. Like consciousness may be something like the wetness of water, that you actually it will turn out in time, that you can actually describe and measure and work out without any regard to the subjective nature of water. No, it's just an analogy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm saying there used to be this view, how is water wet? It's something, wetness, but it turns out wetness is just a manifestation of other
the whole
things.
thing is that we have
And
this
consciousness may be like that. What I'm saying is, you may not have to use the subjective route to fully and completely and totally understand and describe consciousness.
Huge structure.
I agree. I mean, like,
There's no proof that that is necessary.
I agree, but I think the best thing that we can do
I'm not
is make
saying-
measurements.
I'm not saying it's. I'm not saying
If we
I-
can,
I'm not
as far as we
claiming that.
can.
I'm not claiming that that is the absolute truth, but I'm saying
Well,
could
we have-
well be.
But then
You
all
can't
you-
just say never
then
could
all
happen.
you'd have, Tim, is a very good correlate. I think you would be saying that you would have an excellent correlate, and it would people would always be saying, well, that's just a correlate of consciousness. It doesn't.
But no one says that about water, the wetness of water, or the
Exactly.
living life anymore. They used to. Niels Bohr famously said, you know, when he was told about DNA and went to a lecture with Crick and so on, yes, but where is the life? You know, in other words,
That's
he,
essentialism.
yeah,
That is
Vitalism.
essentialism.
vitalism. So that was a big debate 100
That's
years
a
ago.
form
Now
of
it's a non-issue, and in 100 years the same thing will be
What's
true
the
of consciousness, I
resolution?
believe.
Maybe I'm projecting
That is
myself.
no
What
such
would
thing
win
as
it for
life.
me, though, is to have the subjective experience.
To have a computer pump a quality into
If I had a theory
So someone
of
plugs in a
consciousness-
computer and you have these, you know, incredibly expanded subjective experiences of whatever,
The Matrix.
echolocation, you know, ultraviolet radiation, you know,
that would
whatever.
be proof that your system was a conscious generator.
But it's
Yeah.
still
You'll
like
be
a
evident.
subjective experience.
If I have a mathematical description of
I think it's just
it,
about
I was
done
able to
to
predict
death.
it and then experience it.
I mean, I just think
In
culture.
my case, the experience is the text. In normal objective science, we take something and we measure it. Then we measure it in all different ways.
Quanta.
Inside our
That's
head, the
quanta.
only way we can measure our subjective experience is to have our subjective experience.
The only way you can
Here
perform
is a
the
beautiful
objective
thing.
measurement is
It's like
Isn't
we
that a
can,
paradox?
we can measure the wetness of water, we can measure the, you know, the temperature of living
No, we
things.
can't measure the wetness of water.
measure
We
your
measure the
subjective
viscosity of water. It's not the same. That's
Well,
an existential
feel of
property.
the wetness.
I'm saying I can.
The hotness of temperature is a subjective quality. It's got nothing to do with
Wetness is a
One that gets very
molecules.
confused.
And if I
very often.
measure my subjective experience and then compare it to my subjective experience with other attachments, and it's different, I can reasonably say that my subjective experience is now being affected.
I mean, you
Like
ultra
this
rationalists
device.
just become almost semi-Aspergy. You know, sometimes
Well,
whenever
that's really a pathetic argument. Give me a break. Come up with an actual argument.
I'm just,
Yeah.
We'll get back on the security guards in a
Just-
minute.
There's one thing that I could probably suggest you have.
I'm not saying you are Aspergy. I'm saying you act like
I
it.
failed the test.
Jack, sorry, Colin.
The difference between knowing when you've got scientific evidence and when you've made a measurement, they're not necessarily the same thing.
I don't actually use the word, I don't restrict facts to measurements. I think there are perfectly good logical facts around. All bats are placental mammals is a biological fact.
Acquired with the qualia of biologists in lots of work.
What's that?
There was that
No. The
description
point is
was
that I'm
acquired
saying
with
that you're talking about measurement, and I'm just saying measurement's not essential. It's not your fact does not have to be essentially a measurement. It can be a
Oh, okay.
maybe
All right.
simply
Well,
a
the experience
enumeration or a
of the
collection.
replay of a rule that someone else has constructed.
Well, I mean, as I gave that example there, that you're just simply talking about the relationship between two sets, the set of bats and the set of placental mammals.
Okay, but this is still getting back to the original problem of the evidence for qualia. It requires an expanded idea of the concept of evidence. Now, if you've got every law of nature, every description, every mathematical construct, everything that we've ever done in the way of dealing with this world around us has been grounded in our experiential states, to then say that there's no evidence of these experiential states seems to be really strange.
I don't think that's what anybody's.
I think that's exactly what they're saying.
No one's saying that.
That's
What people are
what
saying
you're
is
hearing, which is
that
wrong.
the claim is made that these experiential states are some unique, inexplicable, otherly,
This is the
otherworldly thing.
mysterious.
I'm not
Chomsky
saying they're
and Searle.
inexplicable.
That's
or
the thing I'm questioning. I don't see any evidence that this. Okay, it hasn't been explained yet. But people say this can never be explained, this can never be understood except in its
So
own
you're
terms.
denying
Well,
Chomsky and Searle's Mysterian theory about
Yeah,
consciousness.
but
Okay, I mean, I just want, I'm just trying to get you out, smoke you
I'm
out.
denying that
I'm just-
consciousness is a hard problem. I don't believe it's a hard problem.
We sort of I think we kind of like
It's essential to understand.
See, most people, I'm most sympathetic to the Mysterians because I think, it's very hard. I don't agree, I kind of agree with you, not that it's maybe explicable and along the lines maybe that James is saying, but I certainly agree with the Mysterians that it is, though it might be explicable, it's terribly hard to be explicable. So
it hasn't been explained yet. So
I think, to me it seems you're missing something if you think it's not that hard.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem hard.
Mind-body problem is just totally screwed up so many people's lives. Thinking
Yeah,
the
but
philosophers have wasted.
But that's
dark
they
ages.
get entrapped in language and things. Language is.
I think we are right now.
Yeah, we are doing the classic being entrapped in language. I mean, it's like saying, the dolphins and the apes aren't conscious. I mean, but they don't operate with a language, and sorry, they know more than we know in many areas. They know things we will never know.
They know how to blow really
I've
cool
never
bubbles.
maintained that higher order animals aren't conscious.
No, I know, but this is where you get to in these kind of things. You get stuck in this world of words. I've been talking for a long time in my writings, like for 15, 20 years, about a concept called verbal blindness, where the minute we learn a verbal language, it actually destroys a lot of our knowledge of the world. And I think we all get caught up because we're trying to map things into this verbal language which has colonised our brains, hasn't colonised anybody else's brains, colonised our brains, and has corrupted our ability to think.
Well, when we moved into numbers, we certainly made progress. So I'll go.
They're as bad, and I'm a mathematician, so.
okay. I think we've just about done that.
Yeah.
Wound that
Well,
up.
if we've managed to refine our understanding of the word consciousness a bit, our ideas of what qualia are a bit, and maybe broach the idea that science has got some questions to answer before we make some progress, then we may have actually made some
I
progress.
certainly know what you mean by qualia and what you mean by consciousness. I just don't agree that either of them are of great import.
Does it have any? I mean, James and I think that
agree with that.
the problem of consciousness have a very big relationship to the singularity issue, meaning that I think our thinking, or his James' thinking, I think maybe independently, is that we're worried that singularity might be unconscious.
That would be scarier.
Right? Is that that would be so super smart that
look, it's probably going to be determined in your department.
I mean, I'm not saying we can have a solution there. I just think that's a scary thing to throw out there.
Yeah, the economists are probably going to. It's probably going to be an economic transaction between us and the Kevin Kelly's Technium. I mean, basically, the technical world's going to do what it does, whether it ever becomes consciousness doesn't matter. A lot of the effort of our technology at the moment is only servicing technology. It's not even servicing us. So more than half the technical
correct,
production.
but this is what I'm worried about, is that if you look at the top areas of the elite, they seem to be a little bit, sorry, I was a lot out of line with that crap about Asperger's, but they seem to be a little bit lacking in empathy with what's going on with normal people, and it's a worry, that's all.
We spent 50 years designing cities for cars, and it took us that 50 years to realise we should go back to designing them for people. Because cars don't have value judgments.
I'm speaking to Italian here. We love cars.
Yes.
The problem of the elites not caring
Did you
about
drive here?
people is not a new problem. I've been reading about ancient history.
No, but the
It's
elites.
not a new issue.
Elites now. I mean, I'm talking about the top level guys with the number crunchers. Nothing against the number crunchers, but there's that clear concept there that they might be, sort of drifting away from that feeling of empathy and shared experience that with people, which is a problem. And if they get to own the singularity, the machine.
I'm more worried about the lawyers and bankers running Washington.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. They
Technocrats.
seem to be,
Well, there you're technical.
but they're.
But okay, well that's interesting. But okay, Colin, you got something
I
on?
finished.
Okay.
I think we did that a little while ago.